Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on evaluating systems change and place-based approaches. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands you all are joining us from, wherever in the world that may be, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. In my case, I pay my respects to the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge that in Australia, sovereignty has never been ceded, and we're living and working on what is and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. My name is Cam, and I'm the head of Clear Horizons Academy. Clear Horizons is Australia Pacific's largest evaluation and design consultancy. We're based here in Melbourne, and we support change makers with co-design and evaluation solutions for people, place, and planet. Our academy is all about translating our consultants' knowledge and skills into practical learning opportunities. We deliver courses in a range of topics. They cover measurement, evaluation, and learning, theory of change, data visualization and reporting, as well as the topic of this current webinar, evaluating systems change and place-based approaches. It's quite a mouthful, and we're actually thinking of a way to shorten it to something that's a bit more pithy. If you've attended one of our webinars before, you probably know how things flow, but for those of you who this is your first time, we will kick things off in a moment by throwing out a question to our panelists, and they'll get the discussion going. And then in the final 20 to 15 minutes or so, we'll open up to live questions from you. The questions that I start off with will be questions that we've gathered from you through the registration process as well. If you would like a panelist to answer a question that occurs to you through the session, make sure you type it down in the Q&A box. So you'll see down at the bottom of your control panel, Q&A, click on that. Type your question in there, and if you see a question in there that's already pretty similar to one that you're going to ask, just upvote it, and that'll make sure that we see it, and we'll go with the questions that are the most upvoted. If you have any comments you want to make during the session, please feel free to use the chat box down the bottom. I'll be replying in there and feeding anything that I want to open up to the panelists through there as well. The webinar is intended to be at an introductory level. It's not an advanced webinar. We may kind of veer into intermediate topic areas, but we'll do our best to keep it accessible to everyone, regardless of level of knowledge. If you would like to take more of a deep dive, we offer a course dedicated to this. It's 8 weeks in length, and there's a lot of content in there and a lot of opportunities to go deep with Ellise and with Jess as our mentors. I'll tell you more about that course at the end of the session. We do understand from the information we've got through the registration process that you all want real world examples. So we're going to make sure that we weave these throughout the session. And in fact, one of our panelists is going to bring some information or some experience that she's had of being both a learner with the Academy and also a client, consultant, using these approaches. We will be recording the session and uploading it on social media down the track. And also we'll be sending out the recording to anyone who registered. So look out for that email that'll be landing in your inbox in the next day or two. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Joining me today, we have Samantha Togni, Dr. Jess Dart, and Dr. Ellise Barkley. Samantha is an independent evaluation and social research consultant who's worked with and for Indigenous Australian organisations and communities in Central and Northern Australia for more than 20 years. Sam's particular interests include developmental evaluation and participatory and decolonising approaches to evaluation and evaluation capacity building. Sam's also, as I said, an alumni of our Evaluating Systems Change and Place-Based Approaches course. Welcome, Sam. And thanks so much for making time to be with us here. On the topic of place, I hope you don't mind me asking, what's the first place you intend to visit once these travel bans are lifted?
Thanks, Cam. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'd like to also just firstly acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which I'm living and working here in Alice Springs, Mabantua, which are the Aranda people. So yes. In terms of travel, one place that I've been to and I really would love to return to is Yellowknife in the far northwest of Canada. because I really want to see the aurora borealis. So that's one of, yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, I've not managed to see that. Apparently there's an equivalent that happens in the southern hemisphere as well. Yeah,
yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Jess is the founding director of Clear Horizon and a serial creator of evaluation approaches. She's the author of Place-Based Evaluation Framework and the accompanying toolkit as well. The framework, for those who aren't aware of it, was co-designed with 150 stakeholders and commissioned by the Commonwealth and Queensland governments. Welcome back, Jess, not your first rodeo. And again, same question for you. What's the first place you intend to visit once you're able to go traveling again?
Well, I'm from England. I'm from Yorkshire, and my dad and family still live there. So I'm pining actually to go to the place that I am from. So I am from a place called Wakefield. And they say, you know, you can take the lass out of Yorkshire, but you can't take Yorkshire out of the lass. So I'm still very much, you know, from that place. Yeah, but talking about places, I am standing on the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd also like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging.
Thanks so much, Jess. Our final panelist is Ellise. Ellise is a principal consultant with us here at Clear Horizon, and she also led the testing of the framework I mentioned before with Logan together. Welcome, Ellise. And again, same question for you. Yeah, what's the first place you intend to visit when you can?
Thank you. Well, I am calling in from Duckinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales. So I pay my respects to the traditional owners and the custodians. The land that I'm calling from here is such a beautiful part of the world. Look, I've got some really strong campaigners, 2 daughters who are just busting to get back to Japan. So I think that is top of the list.
Whereabouts in Japan are they thinking?
We went when they were really young and we went all over, and it had a big impression on them, and they have been lobbying ever since.
I actually grew up in Kobe, so I know Japan well. It's a lovely part of the world. All right, thank you, panelists. We'll dive in with our first question. First question, this one's for Jess. What is systems change and what are place-based approaches?
This might sound like a simple question, Cam, but actually it's quite a hard one to answer. And it's one that vexes us, I think, in really explaining what we mean. And because the word systems is used by lots of people. So people think of IT systems, don't they? They think of transport systems, and like people get quite confused. But we are talking about it in a really specific way here. We're talking about a sort of approach to creating change that involves really trying to address the conditions that are holding a problem in place. So it's the approach that defines it. It's this idea of don't just look at the symptoms, look underneath it and see why it's a problem, why it's being held in place. And one way I find it helpful, and if it works for you guys, to really think about this, and it is different. To me, it's different. As an evaluator, I'm a career evaluator, and I guess I grew up evaluating projects and programs and sometimes organizational strategies, sometimes, and that's what I learned, and that's what evaluation teaches us, those sorts of things. This is something else. It's a different type of evaluand. You can see my background here. Evaluand, that's a word, the thing we're evaluating. And it's different because it's not a program. I think that's a really defining feature. And what we mean by that is it goes across programs and across organizations, because if you're trying to address the things that are holding a problem in place, you end up looking elsewhere. You end up going quite broad. The scope's quite broad, and you need to work with a lot of people to do that. So just an example, a really simple example maybe can help here. Let's say you've got a problem with kids not finishing school, right? You got kids not, and you feel that that's important. Now, so a programmatic approach might look at the curriculum and the teaching content and how to engage kids at school. That's a programmatic approach. A systems change approach is going to go, well, why are the kids not engaging in school? And they look beyond the school walls, like start looking in the community. Are there any jobs for these kids to go to? Is there any point going to school? You know, what's happening in their lives? What's happening in the community? What's happening in society that means these kids are not showing up? And you start to work beyond the school walls to address it. You work at all of those things. So this is what we mean by systems change approach. And generally, therefore, it works, it's beyond a program and it's beyond one single organization. It goes across, and that makes it challenging to evaluate. So I guess that's hopefully given you a bit of a sense of what we mean by systems change approaches. But just one more thing that I want to share with you is a diagram. If it's possible to share a slide, Lee, the first slide. I'm not sure whether we can. We'll just see if this works. If it does, I'll just give Lee a second. But it's really trying to understand what does hold a system in place, because and there are frameworks to help us with that. One of the frameworks that I find most useful is a diagram called the Water of Systems Change, and I really recommend that people have a look at that, because it gives you some really good hints as to what are the conditions that hold a system in place. And it's things like structures and mindsets and relationships and funding flows that often we start working with. No, it looks like we're not able to share the screen at the moment, but oh, here it comes. Ah, excellent timing. Okay, so this is the diagram that I was going to share with you, which I think it's really, if you've never come across this stuff before, I really suggest you look this one up, which is the references are there at the bottom, and we can send this slide to you afterwards. You see this picture of the iceberg is at the top. You see the event. So in the example I gave you, what just happened? Kids dropped out of school. So that's what you see. And maybe you might just assume it's because of the curriculum or because of what the school's doing, but actually in the systems change approach, we look under the water. We look at the patterns and the trends, and we look at the systems structures, and we look at the mental models. And it goes that if you're taking this approach, this can change the whole system settings so that it doesn't just rebound into the same place again. So this is a really useful model, the iceberg model, for thinking about it. And usefully, Carnier and Kramer have developed this 6 conditions of systems change, and this is where we can intervene. So you see the mental models, the relationships and connections, power dynamics, policies, practices, and resource flows. And they're the things that perhaps if we change and work on, we will see long-term transformational change. So let's stop sharing that screen now. Let's look back at our people. So I think in essence, what you really need to think about then is what this means for evaluation. And I guess the key things are, this stuff is really long-term, because can't shift the conditions in a year. So often they're long-term initiatives, 3, 6, 9 years long. Secondly, there's multiple partners that need to be involved in it. And often we find it works really well when you put community right at the center of that, because they're the ones experiencing the system. And it has real challenges for evaluation as a result. But I'll stop there. Hopefully that's enough to give you a sense of what we're talking about, that we're not talking about IT systems, and we're not talking about transport systems, and we're not talking about regular programs.
Thanks so much, Jess. And how about place-based approaches?
Yeah, so place-based approaches are one type of systems change approach, and they're in a location. So a place-based approach is working out what is holding perhaps intergenerational poverty in place in a location, and then looking at the whole, all the things that contribute to that system. It works really well in a place because at least you've got a boundary, because the problem with the challenges of systems change approaches is the boundaries are really broad. So if you do it in a place, you have a geographical boundary and you're looking at all the services in that system. So that can be really helpful. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. So what's this framework and toolkit? I said a little bit about it up front, but yeah, we'd love to hear a bit more about it and how it might be of use to the people who are listening. I might start with you, Ellise.
Sure. So back in 2018, Jess and the Clear Horizon team led a co-design process for the development of the place-based evaluation framework and toolkit. And as you said, it was commissioned by Queensland and Commonwealth governments, and it was tested as a proof of concept with Logan Together Collective Impact Initiative in Queensland. And it was the first of its kind in Australia, and what it offers is a really flexible guide with some how-to instructions for how to evaluate these complex systems change and place-based initiatives. So there are some minimum specifications that can help bring some consistency and robustness to how we do evaluation in this niche. And there's also guidance on measurement, evaluation and learning as key pieces. And there's some theoretical components to it, or elements that people can take away and use, whether they're in government, community, non-government organisations. So it's sort of designed for a wide range of audiences, and it's accompanied by a toolkit that has about 80 different tools in it as well. So it really built on where international practice was at that point in time, and since it's been developed, like, we've continued to learn. I think we can safely say that we're all of us, the 150 stakeholders and all the partners, we're all on our learning edge when we were developing it. So it's good to have a chance to have a bit of a reflection on it today.
It's fantastic. 80 tools. That's a heck of a lot of stuff you've packaged in there. Nice. Jess, any key steps or phases that are involved in the toolkit or in the framework?
Yeah, I mean, I might actually just show you a few. If we could share a couple of slides. Slide on at the heart of it is a sort of concept. We call it the concept cube. I love you. I don't know about if any of you, but I'm a bit of a Rubik's Cube fan, and I do play with it quite a lot. But anyway, so we sort of created it. We couldn't do it in 2 dimensions, so we created a concept cube in 3 dimensions. And I guess at the heart of the framework, this cube is the main conceptual piece. So first of all, it happens. You'll notice it's sitting on a square, on a grey square, because it happens in a context, and every context is different. So that's a really important thing. We give ideas in the framework, but they have to be adapted to the context. And then you'll see the change focus, where it says the sort of teal colour up the side, and you'll see that there's 4 levels: the starting conditions, the enablers for change, the systemic changes, and the population level impact. Now you'll note that that's sort of like a really, really basic theory of change. It's like saying you have to have the right things in place at the beginning. You got to work on these conditions that hold problems in place. Then you might start to see some changes in the system, and then it's only then that you get the population level impact. And you'll note on the top there's a bit of a guidance about the years, how long it takes to do this. This has been incredibly helpful, because it helps people set expectations about when population impact is likely to happen. It doesn't happen quick, because you're spending a lot of time setting things up for long-term change. And so that's been a really important part. So therefore, you'll be expecting different changes at different times, and that is embedded into the framework. And then up the side, you'll see 4 in blue, 4 sort of criteria, or 4 lenses, if you like, that we apply evaluation to. At one level, we're looking at change. So we're looking at what changes at each of these levels, what changes in the starting conditions, enablers, and system. We're also looking at process. How well does the process work? How effective is it? And the principles. And these principles are often defined by a community and the way they want things to work, such as community-led and owned. And then they form a very important part of evaluation. And finally, learnings. Because this stuff is so emergent, you have to constantly learn what you're doing. You can't assume that what you start with is going to work. You have to adapt your strategies and your evaluation. It's like you press something in one place, something might splurge over there. But so you have to be ready for unexpected outcomes. So learning's really important. So I guess this conceptual framework is at the heart of what we ended up with. So there's a theory of change. There's a note about when change happens, and the idea that you really need to pay attention to principles, process, learning, as well as looking at the changes. If I could just go to the next slide. So the other part of the framework that's it's a very pragmatic part, really, is just a set of planning steps. I won't go through them in detail, But the first step is framing and scoping the evaluation task, getting really clear on what you're doing. And this is so important with systems change work, because you can bite off different aspects to evaluate at different points. So you really have to you should never try and do it all at once either, so work out which bit you're doing and what that would look like. And then we do advocate a theory of change approach to get really clear on what the theory of change is. And we offer a generic theory of change, which we might look at a bit later to help people, because it does look a bit different. Theory of change often looks a bit different than a program. So we offer some hints in the toolkit about what that looks like, and also using principles, which is a key feature of this approach. And then how you actually develop a set of evaluation questions and think about the methods, and then how you build the learning in all the way through. So those are sort of the steps that the framework follows. So it's probably enough for now, Cam. Yeah, and if you come along to the course, we're going to a lot of examples and details.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jess. Hopefully that gives everyone a bit of an understanding of the framework at its higher level. So I'd love to hear a bit more about how this has actually been used. Sam, how have you found using the framework and applying what you learnt through the course to your work as a consultant?
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I think that I'm working with a collective impact collaboration group whose aim is to improve the outcomes for children. And I'm working with them currently to co-develop their place-based evaluation plan. And so doing the course, the Clear Horizon course, was really useful in gaining an understanding of those core components that Jess has just talked through of the place-based evaluation framework, and what it kind of the elements are that need to kind of be included. So this has been really helpful in guiding the work I'm currently doing, because it's such a comprehensive framework, as well as we've kind of heard a bit about this morning. And so the course really provided a way into the framework that wasn't too overwhelming. And then knowing that there is such more detail and such a rich, pool of resources to draw on that sit behind the framework or within the framework that we can actually tap into as we go along. So the framework has been really useful at providing that initial scaffolding in the complexity of, trying to work out how to do this and how to develop an evaluation plan, and then customizing the development of the plan as we've gone along.
Fantastic. Sounds like it's almost a security blanket or a safety blanket, that scaffolding process, to feel you've got something to fall back on there as you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much, Sam. Ellise, is there anything you wanted to say there in terms of examples of where you've used it or seen others use it in the past, or even where you're currently using it, for example?
Sure. So I worked with partners who have had really positive feedback about how the concept cube and the principles in the framework and the generic theory of change and the toolkit have helped. So that's been good to see. And I've seen it be able to help people make the first steps towards starting to do some measurement, evaluation and learning. And also for those already doing it, it is a good scaffold and structure for building up the evidence that they're trying to collect around the appropriateness or effectiveness or impact or even long-term sustainability of place-based approaches. So a couple of examples are at a national level, we've been working with a few national initiatives funded by government that are supporting place-based approaches in communities, such as Stronger Places, Stronger People and Connected Beginnings. And the approach that's in the place-based framework has really offered a robust way for them to look across a lot of different moving parts and the relationship between those moving parts for a framework that helps them nationally, but also helps guide what happens with communities as well. And it's also given a way to make visible the contribution role that the collective approach or the way of working, which is a different piece in this type of approach. So the contribution role of how we work together can influence the long-term changes as well. And then at the local level, where sometimes resources for measurement, evaluation and learning are a bit thin on the ground, I've seen it being used as a bit of a starter pack. So being able to take an element that fits what resourcing is available and what the priorities are, and be able to do that. So for instance, with a collective impact initiative that we worked with in Queensland, they had some great things in place. So it was about building on the strengths of where they were working. So they had a 90-day action learning cycle that they had set up, really strong learning culture. And then they wanted to go the next step and bring some other stakeholders into more of an annual reflection to gather together the data and the insights that they'd already been collecting through their short cycles that they had in place, in order to think about what they wanted to do in the year ahead, and as a tangible, practical way to go into theory of change, so it wasn't so abstract. So we did a little bit of extra data collection with them through most significant change collection, and just pull together what they had already found out, what they'd been hearing, got some stakeholders together, and they did a reflection process, and that helped them understand the progress that they were making, the challenges and the wins that they'd had, and then that helped them be able to get some priorities for the next 12 months. And it also was a fantastic entry point for them to then go on and develop a theory of change based on what they'd heard. And then from there, they are starting now to set a couple of indicators, just a small set of indicators at the systems level for areas that they're hoping to shift through the investment and their efforts. They know some of their longer term ones that they'd be watching. And so now they're moving into how to track and monitor in a bit of a longer cycle of learning and measurement, but they've just been able to chunk it out to suit the resources that they've had available and just build on the strengths of what they were doing.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Ellise. Great examples there. You mentioned theory of change, and in fact, Jess talked about it as well when looking at the Rubik's Cube. Interested to know how it's used in this approach. Is it used in a different way, very similar way? Yeah, we'd love to hear more about that. Might start with you, Jess, as well. And you're on mute.
Sorry, can you just repeat that question? I was momentarily.
Yeah, no, sure. How is theory of change used in this context?
Oh, theory of change, yes. Theory of change is, as I said earlier, theory of change is a little bit, it plays out a little bit differently in system change places and place-based approaches than it does in a program. So people get a bit stuck with how to portray it. So what we did was we put together what we called a generic theory of change, which is a bit different. So a generic theory of change is, the idea is it's a bit of a starter pack, but you should never just use it. Thanks for sharing. So I'll share you what it looks like here. So we have as you saw at the front of the front face of the cube, it's a bit like that, only spelled out in more detail. You've got the foundations, the enablers for change, the systemic changes in the community, and then the population level things. There's a few more things to note with this one. It also we have this possibility for putting up the side, you know, whether you want to influence some place-based approaches want to influence national policy out of place. So there's a bit of policy pathway, and then there's some empty boxes at the side for community-specific principles if people want to add their own in. And of course, you don't have to stick to these, but this was just an idea, really, of how to get you to think about what each of the levels might be. So foundations is things like, are people place readiness are people actually ready to do this work? Because you need a level of readiness to do it. And whether you have the right sort of resources, such as somebody to facilitate it, and the actual agile and adaptive funders. Note that we're asking funders to show up differently in this space as well. And then you've got the enablers for change. And again, you can use your own enablers, but these are a set of examples of what you might think needs to shift in order to sort of like get ready for this work. And then you've got the systems changes. And these systems level changes are drawn from that work, the pyramid you saw of systems change that I showed you earlier, the waters of system change. And it's about power shifts and flows and actually practices and policy change and mindsets. And the top level, we've got population level impact. We've got a sneaky little extra level in there, which is 4.1, which is instances of impact for individuals and families. And this is just because what we discovered was, while it might take 9 years to get population level wide impacts. You should have some popcorn going off before that. What I mean by popcorn is, you know, when you cook popcorn, it sort of goes pop, 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 and then it goes pop, 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 pop. So it's like, you should have those early pops. You're beginning to see some changes for families that are really useful to build momentum. And so we added that level in. It's more of a measurement level, so it shouldn't really be there, but it was just so useful, we've stuck it in there anyway. So this is the generic theory of change. Which by no means do we want people just to stick to it. It's more to give inspiration to how you might do it. That's probably enough on the theory of change. You stop sharing. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Jess. So those little popcorns going off, is that what Jess was what Ellise was talking about with the MSC story collection? Would that be an example of how you'd be capturing that?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, Ellise, keen to hear some examples that you might have here of how theory of change has been used in your projects you've worked on.
Yeah, so it's both a design tool and also an evaluation tool in terms of a model. So in social innovation, it's a great way to be able to test hypotheses of how you think change is going to happen, do a bit of trying and testing and learning, and then iterate how that pathway of cause and effect happens through the model. So we work with designers and social innovators using it in a really iterative sort of a way. And then we also use it as a design tool. And so as an evaluator, it helps us map out the types of changes we're looking for, and also gets us thinking around how we might be able to track those, whether there's numbers that can represent the changes that are happening at those different levels, or if they're going to be more based on qualitative or story-based information of changes. So really importantly for me, I think one of the key things that it's offered is to be able to help with the setting of expectations around the phases of change happening. And so if you're just starting out in a place-based approach, it's reasonable to expect your changes to be at those lower levels of the theory of change, and identifying how you want to understand and track the changes in how you might be working together. All of that, that's all really relevant when you're starting out. And then, you know, years down the track, it helps then see where we need to have a measurement system to be able to track those medium and longer term changes. So it's a really great evaluators tool, and we've had fun lately trying to bring it to life through dashboards and impact stories as well. And also recently I used it in a summative retrospective way. We were doing an evaluation of COVID-19 emergency relief response in a regional community, and it really worked well to be able to put our findings into a change model that showed the links between the collaboration and the existing relationships and trust that were in the community, and then what they were able to achieve with their emergency relief because of those enabling conditions. So it really made visible some of those lower levels that can get left behind in shared measurement.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ellise. Sam, I realise I haven't thrown a question out to you for a while. Would love to hear any examples you have, particularly of place-based application of this approach of theory of change.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. I love theory of change. I think it's particularly the generic theory of change that is in the toolkit, is in the framework, because I think it really does provide an anchor and a touch point in the complexity of all of this work. And those examples that Ellise has just shared, you know, really demonstrate that, I think. That they're really important for understanding where people are heading with the evaluation of something like this, as well as the strategic development of place-based initiatives. So the group I'm working with, we've been able to use the generic theory of change and really customize it, bring it to life, using a story-based approach to generating the theory of change, which really worked well. And so in a workshop, we had the collaborators there, and we invited them to tell the story of change in 10 years' time. So thinking about 10 years in advance, what do you want this story, you know, to be like? What is the story of change that you want to be told in 10 years? And so we gave them 3 ways of doing that, either by writing a news article, writing a story that they would tell a 10-year-old child in 10 years' time, or drawing the story, the journey of change in a visual way. And so people were engaged in small groups to do that, and it really generated a lot of energy and a different way of approaching it, which was really flexible and tapped into the energy and passion of their work and their vision. And in this particular case, that one of the groups came up with a fantastic news article that, you know, you could just see being published in 10 years' time. It was just full of life. They had direct quotes from, you know, key players that they were saying, this is what's happened and this is what we've done, and this is what we see now, you know, in the community. So yeah, it was a great way into what some people might find an overwhelming task of developing a theory of change. So it worked really well.
Sounds super engaging for the participants as well, like an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, the energy just really lifted in the room when we did it.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Sam. So coming close to the final question before we open up to questions from the group, I noticed there's not too many questions coming in through our Q&A section. So feel free to jump in there and put your questions in there. So this question is, what are the common challenges people encounter when using the framework and the toolkit? What are the roadblocks? I might start with you, Jess.
Yeah, I just want to say, if you're having challenges, you're not alone. This stuff is really challenging. It's challenging for everybody. It's challenging for me. It's challenging for Clear Horizon. We're all struggling with it. Evaluating place-based approaches and systems change approaches is particularly tough. Because of the long-term nature, you don't see change quickly. So you can't, if you just measure those population level indicators that you want to shift, you just might not see any change for years, and you won't know whether what you're doing is working. So you really have to get a bit more imaginative about how you know whether you're on track. And so I just wanted to say that it's generally, I would just say it's challenging. That's the first thing I want to say. And I think, I guess I'll leave the rest of the challenges to Sam and Ellise. Actually, I'll come back, to you.
Take it away, Sam or Ellise, whoever wants to jump in.
You go, Sam.
Yeah, I think I agree with Jess. Like it's very complex work, this work, and so there's always going to be challenges to navigate. And I think one of the things that in the work that I've been doing, it has revealed the need to build in some capacity development in evaluation more broadly, as well as specifically around place-based evaluation more specifically, so that there is a clearer understanding of, when we're talking about evaluating in this space, the difference between place-based evaluation or systems change evaluation and program evaluation, and understanding what expertise people have in their existing groups that they can bring to support the implementation and the communication of the evaluation. And of course, it has resourcing and investment implications that need to be considered. And one of the other aspects of the framework that I think is really useful is that the principles of evaluating place-based initiatives, which are, underpin the framework. And one of those principles is about managing expectation. And I think that there's really great tools within the framework, particularly the concept cube that Jess started out with, that really helps to kind of manage people's expectations of what do we need to be focusing on now to understand, where we're at and what we're achieving, and keeping a line of sight to where we're heading. So yeah, I think capacity around understanding that is really, important in the groups that are trying to undertake this work.
I would add to a few from my perspective as well. So I think that it can be challenging for people to be able to translate and acknowledge what they're already doing, to learn about the systems that they're operating in and the data and the stories that they're already collecting, and sort of translate from the ground up how that relates to the framework. So sometimes it can be overwhelming to do that. But for the partners that we've worked with that have made it their own, have made those local adaptations, so it represents and it serves their needs, and it can look different, you know, to how it is laid out in that framework. That's when we're seeing the best results with it, when it's localized and, you know, that process is invested in just to muddle through and work out how to translate it. I think the other challenging piece in this is how to balance the self-determination and the data sovereignty principles that reflect the place-based and the community-led priorities and principles that sort of are in the ethos of this type of work. So how to do that along with getting measurement systems and sort of a whole approach to data that meets various stakeholders' needs. There's tensions to balance in order to help keep the leadership coming from community about how they want to tell their story and how they want to do that, and also what their needs are from funders and sponsors and other partners in their world as well. So that can be challenging.
Yeah, and just to wrap it up, I mean, to do this work is a balancing act of acknowledging what people already know and the good work that they're already doing, and actually us learning how to do this stuff. And it does require some investment in really understanding what systems change is, I think. Yeah, it's fair to say, don't you think, from both of you? You really have to get your head round what it is and why it's different, and then you have to make sure that everybody understands that. Funders need to understand that too. As well as community, we all need to be in this together and understand how our actions influence the system, that we're all part of the problem as well. And evaluation can be part of the problem too, just so you know that. I understand I am part of the problem. And that's why we all have to work on ourselves as well. So it is a challenge, this is challenging work, but you know, we've talked a lot about the challenges, but it's just worth saying that this stuff does have the potential, and there is evidence to say that it really does have the potential to shift really difficult issues. So it's all worth it, just in case you're feeling overwhelmed. It can work. This stuff, I believe it can work. It just takes a long time.
It's easy to treat the symptoms, harder to get to the root of the cause, but worth it when you do, it sounds like. So our last question here before we jump into the live questions that are coming through. Thanks so much for people who are dropping those questions in there. What would you do differently if you could start all over again? You know, version 2.0 of the framework.
Well, I'll go first, and then I asked Ellise, because she was there with me when we were building it. I wish it was shorter. I apologise for it being such a long document. That's the first thing. I wish it felt really important to context it, and we kept needing to add more in. But it's a bit of a beast. We tried to make it accessible, but it's quite long. So I'd love to make it shorter. I know that's an obvious thing. And I guess the other thing is that I hope that, I don't know if it fully comes across in the framework, that there are lots of different entry points to this work. Like, you don't have to start with a theory of change. Sometimes it's better to start with stories and like understand what's working already. Maybe I would make that clearer in the framework, that there are different entry points and different things are going to work for different communities, but that might have made it even longer. It's the trade-off, isn't it? What do you think, Ellise?
Well, yeah, I'd echo those points and look for further simplicity in, you know, a 2.0. And I think that also there's a great body of examples of practical applications and examples that we could draw on, and just be able to show some pared back versions, some little case studies of how different organisations or groups of people working together have done it in different places, because I think that that's what we've got. We've got more practice-led insights over, you know, 2 or more years of applying it and adopting it and hearing how other people have learned from it as well.
Sounds like we might need to revisit the course. A lot of learning that's happened since it was created. That's great. So now time to open up to some Q&A from the audience. We've got a bunch of questions that have come through here. The one that's top of the list from Carolyn Watts. Can you use the framework to retrospectively understand how a community initiative has gone on to influence government policy?
Shall I take that? I'll see if anybody else wants. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether this framework, you don't need the whole framework to do that in a way. There's probably a couple of tools that do that quite well. One of the tools that we use a lot for tracking where we've influenced policy is, it's a tool with a terrible name that we developed. It's called Significant Instances of Policy and Systems Change. And it's like a rigorous case study approach where you trace through what happened, who did what. You use your theory of change to build a case, and then you use a bit of contribution analysis. And we can share that tool if you're interested. And for one of the other comments, it does draw on this methodology called outcomes mapping, but it's sort of it's not as extensive. It's more of a case based approach that we find a little bit more practical. But that certainly having a clear theory of change helps you make a case for what you did to contribute to the policy change. And that's the methodology we would use. So yes, hopefully that's a good answer.
Sounds good to me. Another question from Rowena Can. I'm interested in examples of measuring the conditions of systems change and the methods and tools that have been useful in telling stories of change across mindsets, policy, practices, etc.
I can jump in with some on that. So one of the tools that we've been working with is a rubric that is mapping out different stages of progress. So you can work together and define what that is, but a rubric really can help you across phases of maturity name what success looks like in different types of enabling conditions that you might be working towards. So it might be around systems leadership, it might be how you're using evidence to inform decisions, it might be around engagement, inclusive engagement. So if you name the conditions or pillars that you are investing in and you know that it might be part of your model, you can be able to track progress in the shorter term through something like a rubric, and you can collect stories through most significant change or other techniques. I mean, what's great about most significant change, which is a story-based, almost like an interview technique that generates a change story, is that it casts an open net. So rather than a semi-structured or a fully structured interview where you're going after information on particular things, this is an open-ended way to hear from people what change is happening and why those changes that they've named are significant in that context, because context is pretty important. So some of the qualitative techniques can really help with that enabling conditions, and also other, like for systems change, you know, versus place-based, you might do some network and systems mapping and things like that to be able to monitor how things are changing across a system and what the conditions are in different parts of the system.
And Sam's got a few cool creative tools that you've used, haven't you? Remember the map you did, Sam, that amazing picture?
Yes, I think I try and incorporate lots of visuals into that process, and looking at how things are shifting and moving so that people can, you know, visualize it, I guess, because it is so hard. It's so invisible, systems change in so many ways. So understanding that visually and seeing things shift and move, I think is always has been helpful in the tools. And I also love the water of systems change, that kind of diagram as well, because we can then look at aspects of those, the 6 components, I think are really useful as well in terms of then understanding what we're seeing shifting.
Fantastic. Great question, Rowena. Sparked a lot of conversation there. Thank you. Michelle McCorg says, does the framework integrate evaluating quality of services and whether they deliver to their program logic, theory of change, and how that impacts outcomes? You need me to read that one again, or we
No, I think we've got it. I'll try and answer that. I think it does a bit, but maybe that's not its strength, because it's trying, you know, when you're trying to take a big picture to see whether you're creating systems change, you're going to make some trade-offs. So there is, one of the criteria is process, which is really talking about process quality. And that in that cube, that is the criteria is there. And we do offer some questions about that. But I guess if you want to know about the quality of services, you probably evaluate each service individually. That would give you more depth. But we do look to see whether the overall theory of change is delivering the outcomes that we expect. But also we want to learn, like maybe something better is happening or something worse. So you really have to keep an open net. But I would guess the focus on quality and processes isn't that as extensive as the focus on learning and the focus on change, to be honest. Yeah, but it is there.
Do either of the other panelists want to jump in there? Any differing opinions?
No, I was just going to add to that by saying that I think that it's in this kind of evaluation, it's looking at how services might be working differently from what they've done before, more than, you know, are they delivering on, you know, kind of what. So I think it's that way of working is trying, which I think really is what defines it from, program evaluation.
And of course the principles. So the principles are a little bit there. So the principles play a really strong role. And if you're not used to principle focused evaluation, it's something to look into. So we generally agree on a set of really important principles, and then we actually evaluate to see whether they are holding up. And so they are, in a sense, quality oriented, but they are things like, is it community led? Is that actually happening? Who was involved? How did that happen? So I guess you are evaluating quality there, but against a set of agreed principles. So it comes out in a slightly different way than you might look at quality or fidelity, for example, in more programmatic settings.
The other thing I'd say, and it's not explicitly in the framework so much, but it's just part of the practice that's evolving in this space, is the truth indicators on the ground. So being able to ask community their experiences of a service and doing that in meaningful ways to see how it feels, to be able to engage with the service using it, because within theories of change usually is the premise that there needs to be a safe and inclusive experience of a service in order for people to use them, in order to generate the benefits and the outcomes that we're working towards. So bringing in that community voice and experience and the lived experience of using the services is an important aspect that a lot of our partners are starting to focus on.
That's great. Thanks, Ellise. Margaret asks, could the instances of theory of change actually represent actual change by early adopters or those who are at a higher state of readiness?
I'll go answer. I think that, yes, true. It is true. They are likely to be the outliers. People who are more ready, you'd imagine that they'd adopt first, and maybe they are have the conditions in place, but we can learn from that and we can build momentum from that. And if that is not happening, you know, you're really not achieving anything. So I guess you might argue that it's not valid, or it doesn't represent anything meaningful, and that's possibly true, but you do it on its own. I think this approach is that you're looking at things from a few different lenses and you're triangulating. But I do find that it would be it's a wasted opportunity not to capture those, because they build momentum, they really build, they motivate people. Oh, we can actually achieve this, and you can learn, how did this happen? How did this happen? You know, what were the things that led to this? How can we make more of it? So I reckon it's really important to include those from a whole number of reasons, but not get too carried away and confuse that with population level change.
Fantastic. Anyone else want to dive in there? No. Okay, next question then. What are the non-negotiable foundations that need to be in place for this framework to work as intended? And this is from Crystal.
Do you want to have a go, Ellise?
Sure. I think that there needs to be willingness and readiness from various partners to embrace this, and so to acknowledge that it isn't traditional program evaluation, and that you're in a complex setting, and so you need to have methods that cater for that and that can cater for the emergent learning and process that happens. And from what's working well from the examples that I've seen, it's where all of the partners who are working together from their different roles that they play, so from the change makers to the sponsors and funders to the delivery partners, that there is a commitment to learning and doing it in a way that's going to suit the context and environment. So I think that's probably the first step and foundation. Otherwise, you are needing to manage expectations that are quite different from those different stakeholders. What else? You two other panelists?
Yes, Sam. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I think reiterating what we said earlier about that people are on the same page about what systems change is, and therefore what are we looking at and why are we investing in this and focusing on this rather than something else. I think that, yeah, like, so building on what Ellise just said, those initial foundations of commitment to change, but then understanding, a shared understanding of, yeah, what is it then we're trying to measure and look for in terms of understanding what systems change is.
Yeah, and I would argue you need money as well, a certain degree of resourcing and time. I do see people trying to do this with nothing, and I just feel for them. You know, this is hardcore evaluation. It needs to be, you know, quite a bit of the budget. You know, people would argue that this might be 10% of the spend needs to be on this sort of work. And remembering that if you don't spend money on evaluation, you won't know whether you're making any difference. You're operating in the dark. It's like a blindfold on, because you're not going to get any results for years. So you do not know whether you're working or not. You could be spending all that time and achieve nothing. So it's a really compelling case to put budget into evaluation in projects like this and learning. It's really as much learning as it is evaluation and demonstration. It's learning your way through, you know, like probing in the dark, finding out what's landing, what's not.
Yeah, I agree, Jess. And I think some ways I describe it to people is it is like part of a risk management strategy for this kind of work, having a built-in evaluation.
You'd be sort of crazy.
Great way to frame it.
Yeah. You'd be crazy to do this work without evaluation built into it, because you will not know whether you're making any difference and you'll be operating blind, unfortunately. Yeah.
So to what extent do disparities in income, education, health, cultures, etc. impinge on shared values and motivations for working together to improve the trajectory of local conditions? This comes from Julie.
I would argue this is not really a question about evaluation. It's a question about the whole approach of systems change. I don't know if anybody feels brave enough to answer it, Sam or Ellise.
Sam, did you want to say anything?
No, I agree, Jess. I think it's broader than evaluation. I think that it's kind of fundamental to, you know, place-based initiatives in terms of understanding, why people are coming together, who's coming together, whose voices are in the room at the table. Yeah, I think they're all elements that really need, you know, important consideration in the beginnings of these initiatives.
And you can see them particularly in the water systems change triangle as well, in terms of what type of power sharing needs to happen, what sort of access, is there confidence building that needs to happen that will help open up participation and enable participation. So it probably reflects the approach to the work itself, the systems change initiative, as well as how people approach evaluation and learning as well. But I think there's lots of systems level things that can be the barriers for a mix of groups coming together. And so making eye contact and being really intentional and thoughtful about those will be really important.
Fantastic. Appreciate you all answering that question, even though it was slightly out of scope. So that is all we have time for, unfortunately, today. I'd love to answer a few more of the questions that are up there, but I might take them and send them through to the panelists. And if there are any things they want to send through, we can send that in the email when we send it out tomorrow. We did have one question there that I will answer around, is it necessary or critical to do the course in order to use the framework and the toolkit? Absolutely not, but it won't hurt. And the course is running at the end of the month. If you are interested, we'll send out info in the email with a special discount, so jump on in there if it's of interest. A huge thank you to our 3 panelists, particularly Sam for making time to join us, and really appreciate it. And again, thank you to everyone who joined us, and we may see you in the course, and if not, maybe in another webinar down the road. Have a great day, and see you all another time.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, thanks.